Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our virtual breakout session, Why Bike Advocates Need to Be Involved in Climate and Climate Justice Campaigns. Gonna keep adding people. We want to thank our sponsors for helping to make this event possible. My name is Riley Teitelbaum, and I'm the League's Advocacy and Outreach Assistant. We do want to inform you that this session is being recorded. And we recommend that you watch the session in speaker view, which you can alter in the top right corner, the view column. You can change that. And we want to encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to have your cameras on. Doing so really helps to make this digital environment feel a bit more communal, and that's always appreciated. If you could update your Zoom name, make sure that it includes your name and your pronouns. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please post them in the Zoom chat. I know that there's the Zoom chat and the Whova one. If you want to use Whova for discussion between yourselves, that's fine, but direct questions, Zoom chat would be where you'd want to direct those, and I'll be making a note of them, and then there'll be time at the end to address as many of those as we can. The session will be equipped with closed captioning, which you can turn on and off using the toggle in the bottom right corner. I believe it is the under the more dots. You can turn that closed captioning off or on, depending on if it is helpful to you. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to introduce our moderator for this session, Jamie Zouras. Jamie is a land use and development program manager at Smart Growth America, where she helps decision makers across the US rethink land use strategy to encourage mixed use, walkable urban form, support communities that have been historically marginalized, and ensure policies take into account climate impacts. Thank you for joining us, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Riley, and it's a pleasure to be here. Welcome, everyone. Before I jump into my presentation, it's my pleasure to introduce our two panelists today, Paul Jones III and Todd Scott. Paul Jones III is a native Detroiter, Master of Urban and Regional Planning candidate at the University of Michigan's Tubman College, and Board Vice President of Transportation Riders United, a transportation advocacy organization in Detroit. Todd Scott is the Executive Director of the Detroit Greenways Coalition, a nonprofit advocating for citywide networks for safe trails, bike lanes, and complete streets that connects all Detroit neighborhoods. So we will hear from them shortly, and I'm going to share my screen. All right, everyone can hopefully see that. So to start today's session off, I will be giving a brief presentation on Driving Down Emissions, a 2020 publication by Smart Growth America that explores how our land use and transportation decisions are inextricably connected. I'll then pass it off to Paul and Scott, who will speak about how advocates in Detroit are making a difference. And as Riley touched on, feel free to drop your questions in the chat function for our Q&A afterwards. So for those of you who aren't familiar with our work already, Smart Growth America is a national nonprofit that envisions a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And we are a collection of programs, one of which is Transportation for America, which works towards a transportation system that connects people to jobs and other essential services, no matter their financial needs or abilities. and by all modes of travel. And we do so through reports and analyses, direct technical assistance, and policy advocacy. So Driving Down Emissions is a report we released in October 2020 that compiles a lot of the research on how transportation and land use decisions contribute to more driving and ultimately climate change. While a lot of policymakers and climate advocates have traditionally focused primarily on electrification and fuel efficiency as the main policy levers to address emissions from transportation, we're seeing a growing awareness now about the need and opportunity to tackle how much we're driving. And so we know that emissions from the transportation sector now make up the largest share in the US, and it was recently surpassed by the utility sector. And that's because after decades of incentives and policies that reoriented almost all community growth around high-speed car travel, most people have to drive to do even the most basic things, even over short distances, and the emissions from those vehicles have skyrocketed. So why does how much we drive matter? You could see here that we've basically been undermining our efforts to address emissions from transportation for the past few decades. While vehicles have become more fuel efficient, emissions continue to go up. So the same premise applies to electric vehicles. Don't get me wrong, electrifying the transportation fleet is absolutely essential, and we 100% need to do that. But we'll make our jobs a lot easier if we don't put all of our focus on electrification. So on the right here is a study that found essentially if vehicles miles traveled, or VMT, continues to climb, we'll need 73 to 79% of electrification to meet our climate targets, which is very ambitious to say the least. But if we can get VMT back to 1990 levels, we could achieve our climate goals with less than 50% electrification. So there's really not a good reason not to do it, especially in the short run, as we're turning over our EV fleets, which takes time. And there's other reasons not to rely exclusively on EVs. One is that direct emissions from the tailpipe aren't the only negative impacts on the environment. Batteries for EVs are currently fairly carbon intensive to manufacture, as are the vehicles themselves, negating some of the short-term benefits. The process of building and maintaining more and more roads also causes emissions. And the very existence of large amounts of pavement increases the impact of rising temperatures due to the urban heat island effect, which is more likely to impact communities of color as well. And that's not even to mention the broader environmental impacts: impervious surface runoff, particulate from tires and brakes, sprawl, etc. So again, EVs aren't a silver bullet, and we need to reduce how much we're driving. So we also know that car ownership is expensive, and there are real disparities in who has access to a vehicle. This chart from the National Equity Atlas shows that racial disparities in household vehicle ownership exist. And of course, we also see disparities by income level. A purely EV strategy could have real equity issues, and Paul will be touching on that more in a bit. So let's talk about how transportation infrastructure and land use policies contribute to growing VMT. When we have cluster development with a mix of housing, shops, jobs, and other destinations, people can take shorter trips to make their daily needs. And if there's safe infrastructure for walking and biking, people can make those trips without driving at all. Sprawling development, on the other hand, requires more and longer trips. And that's why we need to invest in transportation infrastructure, because our current investments encourage development at a driving scale. And that's partially due to a little thing called induced demand. A lot of policymakers believe that if a highway is congested, the solution is to widen it to make congestion go down, which makes intuitive sense, but has been found over and over in research not to be the case. In fact, as this capacity of a road opens up after you widen it, people change their behavior and may take additional trips. Eventually, the development patterns follow additional capacity from the road, and we see sprawl, which induces more driving overall. And within a few short years, the road is back to its former congestion levels. So research has found an elasticity close to 1 for induced demand. And that means that a 1% increase in road capacity produces a 1% increase in driving. So really, expanding roads doesn't reduce congestion at all. And there are other ways that a heavily car-focused approach to transportation decisions undermine our climate goals. Nearly half of all of our trips in the US are 3 miles or less, meaning short trips could be easily taken by non-emitting modes of transportation like walking and biking. But in many cases, that's not possible because conditions on the road are too dangerous or uncomfortable, and the biggest contributing factor to that is vehicle speed. So as cars speed up, the severity of crashes for people outside of cars increases, and so does the likelihood of the crash being fatal. So when we design roads primarily to maintain vehicle speeds and throughput, we make it much harder for people to choose non-emitting options, even for very short trips. While nearly half of these trips are under 3 miles, because they're shorter trips, most of our VMT comes from longer regional trips. It's critical that we're investing in a full system of transportation options to make it possible and convenient to choose not just the car, but walking and biking and good access to transit. So this slide shows research by Transportation for America on Third Way. It's available on the T4A blog, and the report will be released shortly. But what we found is that households' transit access to jobs has a significant impact on how much people drive annually. So again, having transit access requires good land use, and these pieces all do need to fit together, but if they do fit together, it can have a potentially really large impact. So we're in a really important moment right now where we could urge local localities and especially states in ways that actually support and enable low or non-emitting modes of travel. And a key thing advocates can do is really urge states to use their highway dollars responsibly, not just specific funding programs for active transportation. We should be pushing states to continuously put safety first in their investments above preserving vehicle speed. And other areas to focus on are advocating for good land use decisions at the local level and pushing for VMT and land use to be integrated into state level climate policy, excuse me. So that about sums it up. You can download the full report here. And with that, I will turn it over to Paul. Thank you for your time.
Hey, thank you, Jamie. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit today just about just how these issues really come to impact places like Detroit more specifically, and just how I, as an advocate in my role at True, and also as a student and just an enthusiast of urbanism and urban planning in Detroit, and have kind of worked for advocating for bikes in this space. So just to I'm sorry, I'm not able to share, or someone else. I can't see everything right now. But yeah, so
you should be able to share. You should be able to share now.
Okay, I see it. Perfect. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, so Detroit has some of the highest insurance rates of any American city for drivers. And this is a particular point that really drives up the cost of driving in Detroit. And 34% of Detroiters do not own a car at all, and many more aren't really able to have access to enough car for their household needs, especially when we think about economically and all the different things that Detroiters are not able to have access to because of poor transportation decisions throughout history. This is one of the biggest pieces that really has gotten me into that advocacy space for both transportation and bikes. So in my work at, oh, sorry. I'm a little bit frazzled. This matters especially for people with disabilities, seniors we have in the aging population. Youth are often not able to reach different types of programs and the programming that's available from the city that is able to really help enhance their educational experiences and things. So in a city where nearly 80% of residents are Black, it's often very clear who's been disproportionately affected by these types of decisions. In Detroit and in my work specifically, I've really taken a very important history lens to the way that we talk about this work, because it really lends to how intentional a lot of the decisions that have been made over time that have gotten us to the type of car dependent city and to the type of place where it is just incredibly dangerous for people to walk and to bike and to be a part of everyday society without a car. So these are a couple examples that I pulled. The one on the left is from a historic neighborhood in Detroit that was called Black Bottom, that was demolished for a freeway that is now we're in the talks to start to take steps to eliminate that, but really thinking about what it means for those decisions to still be impacting the quality of life and the built environment for Detroiters every day now is a really important, I think, lens to this work, and a really important way of getting people in Detroit interested in this type of conversation around bike lanes and around transportation in a way that we really haven't seen happen in Detroit. And on the right is just an example of it was a just small children's parade that happened on the street in the same neighborhood that was demolished later for highways. So thinking about the kind of civic and public life that's been taken away in ways because of the ways that we've kind of reprioritized our civic energy to elevate the car and not to really think about quality of life and all of the other implications there. So thinking about the public health toll in Detroit, in addition to just the lack of opportunity and other things that come along with people's lives being so tied to their car, Detroiters are also exposed to pollution at much higher rates than the rest of the region. Detroiters suffer from much higher rates of asthma and heart disease, and lung disease within the city, which is often cited as being a result of the existence of highways, the existence of other types of industrial developments that have really been prioritized in the kind of post-war period in the city. And that kind of, the public health and environmental tolls kind of go hand in hand and really speak to each other. There over time have just been so many environmental conversations and decisions that have been made in absence of Detroiters, of Black Detroiters specifically being able to advocate for themselves. And that also built onto the economic toll that we see. There is the example right here of Hastings Streets and Black Bottom. And when we see kind of the freeway removal and think about displacement, we don't also think about the toll of small businesses and just these things that have not been built back over time in Detroit in favor of just kind of more cars, expanding the idea of like kind of commerce running through the city quickly, and not really allowing for us to have spaces where people can be. So that brings me to Transit Riders United. I've been on the board of Transportation Riders United for about 2 years now. And our work has really shifted quickly after the pandemic started. We kind of started out like looking, when I first started on the board, we were looking out kind of long term for this idea of a bigger RTA and regional transit plan. But right now, because of the pandemic, we've really been focusing on one, preserving the levels of service that exist now. So that means just advocating on the ground for making sure that DDOT is providing the level of service that people have been used to, trying to advocate to prevent as many service cuts as we can, but also being a part of some of the conversations that are happening in Lansing that Todd's going to talk about a little bit, that just kind of have to do with how Michigan is moving towards climate change and just the aspirations that are there that are not quite being met with the way that we're really attacking the issues. So at True, we are working with other organizations to build a coalition to start to think about these things in this way. We are also working with other groups. I'm actually on a team here at U of M that is working to do research at the state level to understand how we are going to be able to start to really find the levers that are most important to start pushing in Michigan to start to see our mobility conversation move away from this idea of car dependency and of electrifying an already broken transit system to start to really move into what it would mean for us to move away from just the poor land use and transportation decisions that we've seen kind of impact quality of life. So I hope I wasn't too rambly. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it off to Todd just to really dig into Detroit Greenways work and yeah, what they're doing in Detroit. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Paul. So as Jimmy mentioned, I'm with the Detroit Greenways Coalition, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit advocating for a network of greenways, complete streets, and bike lanes that safely connect people, places, and improve the quality of life, beautify neighborhoods, and stimulate economic development at the neighborhood level all across the city of Detroit. And we've recently got very involved in climate action. We did because increased biking and walking should play a major role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we saw this as an opportunity to better fund our work, and our board really agreed with it, fortunately. There was really not much, we did not have to sell them so much on it because they understood what this could mean for helping us realize our mission. In September of 2020, Governor Gretchen Whitmer issued an executive directive to create the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan, which would put the state on a path towards becoming fully carbon neutral by 2050. We were skeptics because our governor often touts Michigan's role in promoting motorized transportation without acknowledging how this has increased greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, in this image here, she was at a press event talking about climate-induced flooding on our state freeways. She missed the irony of being on a freeway that the state will soon widen, which will induce more traffic and increase greenhouse gas emissions. So in 2021, an advisory committee was formed that helped the state create the plan to reach carbon neutrality. We were on that council's transportation and mobility work group. And our assignment was to develop recommendations that reduce transportation greenhouse gas emissions, which of course are the largest source by economic sector. And our work group really focused on two main areas. One was electrifying transportation, and the other was decreasing vehicle miles traveled. And of course, I spent most of my time on the latter. The basic problem in Michigan, and certainly probably in other states as well, is that from 1980 through 2019, Michigan's total vehicle miles traveled climbed 67%, while the population only rose 8%. And this is how transportation became the largest source of our greenhouse gas emissions. Our population is stagnant, but everyone's just driving more. And of course, the Michigan Department of Transportation considers this a success. Their 2045 long-range transportation plan associated decreased VMT with a stagnant economy. In fact, when they released their draft of this plan last summer, they completely failed to acknowledge the governor's carbon neutrality pledge. They heard about that from us and they changed the plan, but it still shows that they're not all that serious about greenhouse gas reductions. So our work group developed 3 recommendations for reducing VMT. We initially considered setting VMT reduction targets, we felt this was kind of like a non-starter for MDOT since they love VMT. Besides, we've seen how MDOT likes to set and forget their fatality targets. And so I felt that if we just did the VMT targets, they would ignore those as well. So I'd read about Colorado developing greenhouse gas emission budgets for their road agencies. This basically meant that if a road agency wanted to widen a road or induce more travel, they would have to invest in green transportation to offset those increases. And it's enforced through funding, so it has teeth. I thought MDOT would be more comfortable with the concept of budgets, and they're more likely to follow them. So this was really our first recommendation. Our second recommendation was to invest more in public transportation. And our third was to shift motor vehicle trips to walking and biking. I really wanted a recommendation that was data-driven and very specific. We don't have regular up-to-date data on travel modes, but we do have decent crash data. And safety is a major deterrent to more people walking and biking. So I borrowed from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law's new Highway Safety Improvement Program. Currently, Michigan spends 1.4% of their safety money on pedestrian improvements and 0 on bicyclists. So with bicyclists and pedestrians making up nearly 20% of road fatalities, the new law will change this. It's going to force the state to spend at least 15% of their safety funding to improve walking and biking, and it must be used in a data-driven, safe systems approach, which we support. So my recommendation was for Michigan to implement this safety approach starting now and continuing through 2050. The rest of our work group mostly worked on vehicle electrification. From my perspective, they were really more interested in the economic benefits of building electric vehicles rather than addressing climate change. That was evident when I asked how they account for the increase in greenhouse gas emissions associated with the EV manufacturing. And their response was they'd ignore it since those emissions were no longer in the transportation sector. They were also willing to ignore EV emissions. EVs have 0 tailpipe emissions, but they have substantial emissions from tires and when they resuspend road dust. As mentioned by Jamie, batteries also add substantial vehicle weight, and there was no discussion on how this will increase crash severity, especially for bicyclists and pedestrians. So both emissions and safety have a greater impact on communities of color, so making these environmental justice issues, and they were just completely overlooked. So it became apparent to me that EVs are to the auto industry what recycling is to the plastics industry. The industries are trying to reduce consumer guilt by overselling their products' green aspects in order to maintain the status quo. Sorry, that sounds so negative, and I do recycle. Even still, I did try to get e-bikes included in this discussion. They've been completely overlooked despite having significantly lower greenhouse gas emissions during their manufacture and operation. They also help address the equity issues since you don't need to have expensive insurance. Not everyone can afford a brand new EV, much less operating them. And so e-bikes and public transit are really much more affordable and green options for many people. But one comment I heard from our work group was how realistic it was for people to replace vehicle trips with bike trips. However, this same person found it realistic that Michigan could switch its entire vehicle fleet to EVs, that we could develop a statewide charging network, and that all our electricity generation could be from renewables. So that really shows you the mindset that we're going up against. And lastly, I'll add too that the governor recently proposed a $2,500 purchase incentive to help EV buyers, but nothing for e-bikes. So this was very disappointing, but really not all that surprising. The state did release a draft of the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan for transportation. It largely focused on transportation or on electrification, which was no surprise. Did have some vague support statements for biking and walking and transit. It doesn't acknowledge the equity issues related to vehicle costs, operations, safety, and emissions. It also ignores land use and how we're going to continue to sprawl, building lower density development where biking and walking and public transit just don't work well, where you have to drive everywhere. Unfortunately, these things just weren't in the plan. I also had too, sprawl. We often talk about sprawl as places where everyone has to drive, but it also involves manufacturing. In the old days, we used to site our manufacturing plants near railroads and rivers so that they'd have access to green transportation options. And we no longer do that, which means we have a lot more trucks on the road, which is just not all that bike friendly. But we were able to meet with representatives who are writing this state report, as well as the governor's advisor on the environment, and they were receptive to our concerns. But it's really too soon to say whether that we'll see any of our recommendations reflected in the final plan. So I mean, I think I sound a little bit negative on this, but I think in the long run, I mean, no matter what's in the plan, they won't get to carbon neutrality without us. And so I think that's my final message. I mean, this plan may not work. It may not get us to carbon neutrality, but maybe the next one will. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul and Todd. We have a few audience questions coming in. If you all think of any more, please drop them in the chat. But first, we have a question. If anyone has any suggestions for getting really conservative folks in southern rural areas who love their cars and trucks to take the climate crisis more seriously. Any suggestions welcome. I don't know, Todd or Paul, if you have any input on that.
No, but I did see that Matt Penniman from the League of Michigan Bicyclists posted a Wikipedia link for Catherine Hayhoe. So I'm not familiar with her, but that might be something worth checking out.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, it's it goes hand in hand. The infrastructure is built for accommodating big cars and trucks. So if we change the way we're managing our land, then action and behavior change will hopefully follow suit to a certain degree. Another question we had for Paul, how is your messaging and concern conveyed to low-income populations in Detroit?
Yeah, so I would say two answers to that. One, from True, we really value public outreach and engagement, and also just partnership with other groups like Motor City Freedom Riders, who really do some of the one-on-one engagement with people who ride the bus often. So we are very interested in that work and listening to people and getting their concerns. I would also say for me personally, I've really tried to push to use as much social media, op-eds, and those sort of things to really make the case of just connecting the environmental justice issues of transportation back to some of the histories and things that we've seen in Detroit, and like how we've seen decisions be made over time. So yeah, I would say from the organizational point, we've really been doing that work directly, but there's a lot of work to be done in Detroit. I think the way that we've implemented a lot of different bike infrastructure projects has not been well received by residents, by low-income residents, because we haven't really seen the city taking the approach of doing that in a way that's like prioritizing safety and prioritizing like environmental justice and those things. So yeah, it's being done, but I think there's a lot of improvement to be done in how we're talking to people about about these issues. And I think that also speaks to the conservative part, where the way that we're framing and talking to people about the problems is probably more important than some of the underlying kind of assumptions that people make about these things.
I could jump on there too, because we have heard some pushback about bike lanes because of climate change. Residents are suffering from flooding, and which is an immediate short-term effect which needs to be addressed and needs infrastructure investment. And so people are saying we shouldn't be spending money on bike lanes, we should be spending it on sewers, without thinking about there's a short-term and long-term investments that we need to make to address both issues. So we're struggling a little bit with the messaging on that, but making sure folks know that we need to do both.
Yeah, thank you both. Another question that came in, how is the infrastructure bill impacting these issues? And I could kind of jump in there. and add that Smart Growth America and Transportation for America has a great resource hub that I will drop a link in the chat to, that folks can check out for specifics on the infrastructure bill and how it breaks down. But in general, I think it's important not to get overly focused on the competitive grants that are in the bill. And while these are important, there's a lot of flexibility given to states to do good things with their highway dollars. And they could choose to invest those highway dollars to support walking, biking, and transit, which the Federal Highway Administration does support. And yeah, the alternative would be to continue to use the highway dollars for creating unsafe conditions where people can't get around without a car. So really keeping your states focused on those highway dollars. All right, looks like we got a few more questions in the chat. Bruce says, how much success have you seen in revisions to zoning codes to address emissions reductions? How important are zoning codes in reaching emission reduction goals? Any input on the Michigan side?
I really don't have much on that. I know we do have anti-idling ordinances. I don't know how well they're enforced. That's all I know at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add that zoning codes that support a mixed-use transit-oriented development where it's conducive to walking and biking, limiting parking requirements and making the built environment more conducive to being people-oriented rather than car-oriented can play a large role. And let's see, Matt says, is the war on cars frame helpful or harmful to the political project of building support for biking and walking?
Yeah, I think that's a good question that is particularly relevant in what we call the motor city. I'm not, I would say, absent of the alternatives being presented to people in a way that they really understand, in a way that they can really just kind of relate to. There can definitely be drawbacks, because I think when we talk to people in Detroit about imagining a future that has transit and that has bike lanes on every street and those sort of things, they aren't really able to see how that would benefit them and how that would fit into their day-to-day. So I would say, I think that aggressive framing, absent of really demonstrating what that vision and what that utility could look like for people, can definitely be a little bit of there can be some blowback there.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think it comes down to, do you want to feed red meat to the choir, or do you want to grow the choir? We always want to grow the choir and get more people on board on our side. And I think by making a polarizing statement like a war on cars doesn't really help with that.
Cool. Let's see. We have a comment or question from Jeff. It looks like the EV discussion point is a little more nuanced. It is not a good versus bad solution. I like to take the conversation to EVs to cycling. Yeah, depends on the use and the context. Totally agree there, Jeff. All right, any last questions? We have about 5 minutes remaining.
Well, Jamie, there was a question about access to bikes.
I must have missed it.
Yeah, and so Detroit does have a MOGO public bike share system that's been very successful. It really does have a good focus on getting more people on bikes. People who are on state assistance can get an annual pass for $5. So they have a very high uptake in that annual pass, and they get a lot of people using MOGOs And they've also have a MOGO program for people with disabilities as well. So it's been very successful. I mean, there was some, I think in the very beginning, there was a little bit of crime, but I don't think it's been any different than any other city. And so MOGO has actually expanded their footprint and continues to expand across Detroit. But that's just one model, because in some residential areas, getting MOGOs in a residential area might not work. So we've been looking at other models where perhaps we do fundraising, where we do bike giveaways. We do a Bike for Essential Workers program. The city has done e-bike leasing programs through employers to help get bikes in the hands of some of their employees. And of course, we've had a earn a bike program for kids and adults, and that's been going on in Detroit for a long time. So I think, you know, all those together can be a way of getting more bikes in the hands of folks and making it easier.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, and along with bicycle infrastructure, Austin said, or is asking how folks can respond to concerns that bicycle infrastructure are contributing to gentrification, and how to deal with the inequitable distribution of that bike infrastructure.
Yeah, so this is something that has come up quite a bit in our city, and I would say my biggest response is, if we really Black cyclists are the ones who are like suffering the most on Detroit streets, and as the same goes for Black pedestrians. So I think really, if people see that the city is like really planning this infrastructure in a way to attack those issues and to really respond and to really think about how we create a safe network more holistically, I think that is one very important like key thing that we should be doing to kind of eliminate that fear, and just to make sure that people are seeing like this infrastructure really being planned and built in a way that's working for them, which has not been the case in the past. So I think there's a real opportunity to do it right, but people rightfully in cities like Detroit have been concerned with kind of schemes where we've seen it kind of following more of an economic development lens than an actual safety and just vitality lens.
And I could mention one project that is probably the big non-motorized project in Detroit. Is called the Joe Louis Greenway. It's a 27-mile trail around the city. And I think one way that it addressed gentrification is it became much more than just a biking and walking trail. The city incorporated in affordable housing, neighborhood redevelopment, and tied all that together so that people wouldn't get displaced when the trail goes in. And so I thought that was really, really much a great vision for how to do bike infrastructure, is not just focus just on the bike park, but consider the needs of the community that you're going through and incorporate those needs into your project.
Yeah, thanks, Paul and Todd. Jeff asked if there is a complete streets policy at the state level in Michigan or in Detroit specifically.
No. So we've been working on this for a long time. We started this before Detroit went through bankruptcy. And there was a lot of fear on the part of the city to do a complete streets policy because they thought there were some financial obligations that they wouldn't be able to meet. But in response to that, they actually started building complete streets to say, we don't need an ordinance. Look, we're doing it already. And they've continued to do a pretty good job. I mean, we have a complete streets department within Public Works with, I think we have 5 employees. We have a deputy director of DPW who also oversees complete streets. So I think they're doing a good job. And maybe this year will be the year we actually pass an ordinance to actually put it in to codify it. We'll see. And the state does have a complete streets ordinance for MDOT, but it's really pretty lame because they can require local governments to do all the maintenance of the complete streets. And if a local government can't afford or doesn't want to take on the maintenance of complete streets features on state roads, then MDOT says they don't have to do it. So it's not been a very effective policy, unfortunately.
All right, and we're rounding out the end of our session. So Unless there's any last minute burning questions, I will pass it back to Riley to close us out. Thanks everyone for your time.
Thanks everybody for joining us for this session and being a part of this year's National Bike Summit. Yeah, not much else to say, but keep going to events, and yeah, we're really pleased to have you. So thank you everyone, and take care.
Thank you, everyone.